So, good evening, everybody. Dear colleagues, dear students and guests, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of the US Visiting Scholar 2026, Professor Gilbert Rodman, entitled No Reason, Intellectual Work in Times of Monsters. My name is Giulia Pelillo, and I'm the head of the research area Cultural Studies here at the Vienna School of International Studies. And tonight I have the pleasure to introduce the lecture and moderate the discussion. Before introducing our speaker and inviting him to take the floor, I would like to say a few words of gratitude to Fulbright Austria. Without their long-standing commitment to strengthening cultural relations between the United States and Austria, we would have far fewer colleagues and friends on both sides of the Atlantic with whom we can think together about the critical times we are living in. These networks are always important, but they become indispensable when political relations and multilateralism themselves enter into crisis. Last year, we celebrated 25 years of collaboration between the Diplomatische Akademie Wien and Fulbright Austria. This is an important milestone, and the legacy of this partnership matters deeply today, at a time when transatlantic relations have become more unstable, and when the very political, cultural, and ethical foundations of these relations are being challenged from within. We are living through a moment in which intellectuals and those committed to multilateral, peaceful, and democratic orders are marginalized by populist and authoritarian actors and sometimes replaced in the public sphere by extremist ideologues and or powerful tech elites. To point to just one recent example, only last week, the US blogger Curtis Yarvin spoke at a public event here in Vienna, attacking, among others, so-called campus intellectuals, a supposedly corrupted Brussels, the dominance of mainstream media, and environmental movements. Moments like this remind us that the public role of intellectual work is increasingly contested, and that the spaces in which knowledge, critique, and democratic dialogue can unfold cannot be taken for granted. Against this background, it is crucial that we do not give up. Instead, we must strengthen alliances grounded in the shared practice of thinking together across national and disciplinary divides, a practice that Fulbright Austria has long been committed to supporting and continues to nurture today. So let me once again express our sincere thanks to the entire Fulbright Austria team and extend a very warm welcome to Lauren Moser, who represents the team with us this evening. It is precisely through initiatives like this that spaces for thoughtful dialogue can continue to exist and flourish. And this is why tonight's lecture matters. Gilbert Rodman's inaugural talk, No Reason, Intellectual Work in Times of Monsters, promises to illuminate these concerns and offer reflections that will guide us into a discussion following the lecture. We are very pleased that 6 students of the Diplomatic Academy have already registered to intervene, so we will give precedence to their contributions and then open the discussion to the wider audience. Let me now briefly introduce our speaker. Gilbert Rodman is Associate Professor of Communication Studies at the University of Minnesota. From 1995 to 2006, he was a faculty member in the Department of Communication at the University of South Florida. He has also taught as a guest professor at the University of Turku and at the University of Heidelberg. He's a former chair of the Association for Cultural Studies and the founder and longtime manager of the oldest and largest listserv devoted to cultural studies. Gil's research lies at the intersection of cultural studies and critical media studies, with a particular focus on the cultural politics of race and racism, digital technologies, intellectual property, and popular culture. He's the author of Why Cultural Studies and Elvis After Elvis, editor of the Race and Media Reader, and co-editor of several influential volumes, including the recent Better Stories, Mapping Cultural Studies. I've had the pleasure of collaborating with him in the past, and we are also currently involved in several collaborative projects, such as the Future Conjunctures Research Group and a podcast series on culture, media, and language. Here at the Diplomatic Academy, Gil is teaching seminars on digital culture and technology and the politics of popular culture. We are truly happy and honored to have him with us this semester. Dear Gil, the floor is yours.
Right, is this on? This is on, right? Okay. Many thanks to Giulia for the very kind introduction, and for the past 7 years of stimulating intellectual collaboration, without which I would not be here today to give this talk. I very much look forward to many more years of the same. Many thanks as well to both the Diplomatische Akademie Wien and to Fulbright Austria for giving me the opportunity to spend the first half of 2026 in Vienna as part of a unique and vibrant scholarly community. It's been a fabulous 2 months so far. I'm excited to see what the next 4 months bring. I also want to send strength and love and solidarity to my friends and neighbors back in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I flew to Vienna on Christmas Eve, right before Operation Metro Surge began in earnest, and so I've had to watch from afar over the past several months as ICE thugs have occupied the Twin Cities and assaulted, abducted, terrorized, and murdered innocent people over and over again. Like millions of others around the world, I've watched the good folks of Minnesota respond to this unjustifiable brutality with amazing courage, resiliency, creativity, and care. The cliche at this moment would be for me to say that I wish I were back there in the streets with you all. But that would be a lie. Because what I really wish is that the world were a better place, that the ICE thugs would go away, and that you didn't need to be in those streets at all. Now, before I get to the core of my talk, I need to make 2 important caveats. Caveat number 1 is that this is not the conventional presentation of research that I gather has been typical for previous Fulbright scholars at the DA. I considered giving such a talk, but the exigencies of the current moment seem to demand something else. To state the obvious, it's a strange time to be a US citizen in another country. In the past, when I've traveled abroad and met new people, the first substantial questions that they've asked me have typically been some version of, what brings you here, or what do you do? Sometimes the conversation would turn to politics or the state of the world, but not always. Ever since I arrived in Vienna, though, the first question people have asked has almost always boiled down to some version of, what the hell is going on in the US? And as much as I wish I could respond to such questions by saying that things aren't really as bad as they seem from afar, such reassurances would be lies. In this moment, then, it seemed awkward for me to ignore the goose-stepping elephant in the room and give a business-as-usual talk about something like my ongoing research on race and copyright. Such a talk might still happen before I leave Austria later this summer, but not tonight. Caveat number 2 is that, perhaps unsurprisingly, this is not a feel-good talk. The world is on fire in more ways than one and in more places than just the US. I'm not going to pretend to have good answers for how to put those fires out. I don't. In fact, I actually want to make you even more uncomfortable than you already are. Hopefully, this will be a different and even productive kind of discomfort compared to reading the news. But it's the kind of comfort that is actually one of the most important things that I think cultural studies has to offer. That is, a discomfort that aims to unsettle the ways that people typically think about and see the world, and in so doing, even if it doesn't always have the answers to offer that people want, it can still hopefully help us ask better questions than the ones we are currently asking. My talk has 3 parts, each of which aims to unsettle the ways that many of us think about the major concepts invoked in my title. Starting from the middle and then working outward, I want to suggest first that intellectuals are unavoidably more enmeshed in politics than we recognize, and thus we should lean into being political more than many of us do. Second, that the monsters are not quite who we think they are. And then finally, to suggest that no matter what its very real virtues are, reason will not be what saves us from our current crises. So, intellectual work. Last week, Fulbright Austria held its U.S. Scholar orientation for the summer portion of its 2025-26 cohort. It was an entertaining and enjoyable event, and I'm happy to see a few people in the room here tonight who I met last week. We were told more than once that a vital part of our role was to be cultural ambassadors, that wherever we went in Austria, we will be representing the U.S. to Austrians, and that when we return home, we will share our experiences here in Austria with our friends and colleagues in the U.S. At the same time, we were also reminded, more than once, that we are private citizens and that we do not formally represent the U.S. government, the U.S. Fulbright program, Fulbright Austria, or our respective host institutions. We are told that we are free to express our own views and opinions, but that when we do so, we should also make it clear that we are only speaking for ourselves. Now, there are two major tensions at play here, one of which is common to any relationship that intellectuals have with specific communities and institutions, while the other tension is much more peculiar to the current moment. Together, they help to highlight the particular approach to intellectual work that I want to suggest we need more of. Tension number one may already be obvious to some of you. Let me describe it in personal terms. I stand before you tonight as a Fulbright Austria U.S. scholar and a visiting professor of international studies at the Diplomatische Akademie, Wien. I would be willing to bet that most of you are here primarily because of your relationship with and or respect for one of those two institutions, and maybe both of them, and that you had never heard my name before it showed up as a part of an announcement from the DA or Fulbright Austria. In other words, very few, if any of you, have set aside time on a Monday evening because you want to hear Gil Rodman, private U.S. citizen, hold forth for 30 to 40 minutes on any subject at all, much less the current state of the world. Most of you are here because you wanted to hear a Fulbright Austria speaker or a DA speaker, and I am merely the semi-random person who is playing that role tonight. To be sure, whatever I say here really does represent my personal views. Neither the DA nor Fulbright Austria has vetted my talk in advance, nor do they necessarily share my views. And yet, at the same time, I definitely feel a burden on my shoulders not to say anything that would make either institution regret having invited me to Vienna for 6 months. My freedom to express myself is thus constrained, loosely and informally, but palpably, by my desire not to alienate my hosts and sponsors. Meanwhile, no matter how many disclaimers I make, no matter how sincerely I might make them, for many of you in the audience, whatever I say tonight will necessarily reflect on at least one, if not both, of the institutions who have brought me to Vienna. You will remember me, for better or worse, not as Gil Rodman, private U.S. citizen, but as that Fulbright Austria speaker I saw at the DA in March. Tension number two will be less obvious to most of you and is much more unpleasant. More than one session during last week's orientation found an official from the U.S. Embassy reminding us that we were free to voice our own opinions as long as we also made it clear that we did not and do not speak for the U.S. government. Now, you might think this sounds exactly like what I talked about as tension number one. And at any other moment in the history of either the U.S. Fulbright program or Fulbright Austria, you'd be right. This year, however, because the Trump administration has decided that certain topics, including but not limited to race, gender, immigration, and climate change, are too woke to be supported by U.S. taxpayer dollars, Nearly 200 scholars whose applications had received final approval from Fulbright's U.S. Academic Board were rejected after an additional review from the U.S. State Department. In the 80-year history of the Fulbright program, that extra layer of politically motivated scrutiny had never happened before. And it was egregious enough and invasive enough that all 12 members of Fulbright's U.S. Academic Board resigned in protest. Last week, roughly half of us at that orientation, myself included, were part of that group of 200 scholars, rejected by the State Department for being too woke. We are only in Europe now because Fulbright Austria had already seen our files. They were able and willing to support our grants independently of the U.S. Fulbright program and invited us anyway. And so for many of us, there was an incredible irony involved in being reminded by U.S. embassy officials that we did not speak on behalf of a government that had already made it extraordinarily clear that it did not want us to represent it at all, even in the most informal and tenuous of ways. These tensions exist at different ends of a continuum that all intellectual work takes place on. At one end, intellectuals are expected to conform precisely to the values and beliefs of whatever community, institution, organization, or government they belong to, and deviance from that party line is not permitted. At the other end, intellectuals are actually expected to express non-conforming opinions, and to do so with enough frequency that disclaimers are required to prevent confusion. Except that even here, neither the intellectual nor the institution involved can ever fully separate themselves from the other. There are real and important differences between these extremes, but the distinction is not between intellectuals who are in ideological lockstep with their sponsors and intellectuals who are completely free of institutional constraints. Rather, the distinction is merely whether those constraints are enforced by hard power or soft power. Now, at this point, I'm treading on ground that Edward Said covered in Representations of the Intellectual, and he did so in much more detail and with much more skill than I can do justice to here tonight. He wrote about the always fraught relationship between the intellectual on the one hand and the various institutions, communities, societies, and nations they are associated with on the other. A vital piece of Said's argument, and mine as well, is that there is no pure space of absolute independence in which intellectual work takes place. We always speak from positions in the world that are not entirely within our control. We always speak to audiences who necessarily, albeit often implicitly, shape our words if we are going to be effective in reaching them. And those two sets of constraints mean that we always speak in the service of some cause outside of and larger than ourselves. For Said, and again, I agree with him, those three facts place a heavy political burden on the intellectual. And he describes this way, quote, "There's an inherent discrepancy between the powers of large organizations, from governments to corporations, and the relative weakness, not just of individuals, but of human beings considered to have subaltern status, minorities, small peoples and states, inferior or lesser cultures and races. There is no question in my mind that the intellectual belongs on the same side with the weak and unrepresented." Unquote. To be sure, not everyone who understands themselves to be doing intellectual work shares this particular burden. There are intellectuals who believe themselves to be pursuing Platonic ideals such as truth, beauty, or knowledge for knowledge's sake, or who situate their work in the service of some broader, supposedly apolitical cause, an academic discipline, corporate research and development, some allegedly neutral government agency, and so on. But like Said, I want to insist there is no such thing as truly apolitical intellectual work. Whether we like it or not, whether we admit it or not, all such work carries a political weight of some sort. Given that reality, Said's choice to work and speak in the service of social justice strikes me as the most graceful and valuable way to live with the unavoidable tension that comes with being simultaneously independent from and part of an institution. And this brings me to monsters. Some of you may recognize the time of monsters part of my title as a reference to an oft-quoted passage from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci and his prison notebooks. The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. Some of you may also know that this isn't what Gramsci actually wrote, and you're right. But bracket that thought. If you want to, we can come back to it during the Q&A. Over the past year or so, I've heard a lot of folks in the US who object to the current administration state quite bluntly, this is not who we are. This refrain is more than just an expression of ordinary differences of political opinion between conservatives and liberals. It's a flat rejection of the policies and actions of the current government, and an unequivocal declaration that, as a nation, the US is better than this. It's a claim that what we're seeing on the news and in the streets is morally and ethically repugnant, and that those who are perpetrating these horrors are acting well outside the realm of acceptable behavior. It is a very polite way of saying that the nation is being run by monsters. I fully understand why people are distressed and why they want to take a clear, visible moral stance against the current administration. I share those feelings. At the same time, however, and with all due respect to my friends and family who have joined in the "not who we are" chorus, I have to disagree with them on that point. Because this is, in fact, who we are. Very much so. Arguably, it's who we have been ever since 1620. A few weeks ago, when I had finally decided on the title for this talk and shared it with Dr. Pelillo, she wasn't so sure about the time of monsters part, saying that she would be more inclined to characterize our current moment by invoking Hannah Arendt's famous line about the banality of evil. She's not wrong about that. Much of what's going wrong in the US right now is depressingly a continuation and or extension of logics and practices that have been commonplace for a long time. And much of it is enabled by the willingness of tens of millions of people to shrug all these horrors aside as if they were somebody else's problem, or worse, as if they were not a problem at all. To drive the point home, there's nothing at all new about the US throwing its political, economic, and military weight around the world in forceful and unjust ways. Nothing new about armed government agents treating black, brown, and immigrant communities as threats to the social order who can justifiably be assaulted and murdered in the streets. Nothing new about powerful businessmen and politicians engaging in human trafficking and sexual abuse of women and girls. Nothing new about a US president believing himself to be above the law and acting with authoritarian impunity. Nothing new about any of these monstrous acts and others going unpunished and even being celebrated by significant portions of the population. All of these ugly phenomena are sadly, regrettably, disturbingly normal. So there are good reasons not to think of our current moment as the time of monsters. At the same time, however, I think there are also very good reasons not to think of our current moment as if it were simply business as usual. While there are many more continuities between Trump's administration and previous administrations than a lot of people in the US seem willing to recognize, there are also many sharp distinctions. Perhaps the simplest way to demonstrate this point is to consider Canada. The US and Canada share the longest unfortified, undefended border in the world. Prior to Trump's re-election in 2024, the last time the US and Canada were serious enemies was in 1814. Arguably, the only significant conflicts between the two since then have been in the context of over-the-top fictional satire. Michael Moore's 1995 film, Canadian Bacon, and the 1999 South Park movie. And in both cases, the staggering improbability of the US and Canada going to war with each other was the very core of the joke. But then in Davos in January, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney took the global stage and openly described the impact of Trump's first year back in office as, quote, a rupture, not a transition, unquote. He declared the pre-Trump rules-based international order to have been merely a useful fiction that Canada had only gone along with quietly in the past because it benefited from that fiction. He called for a coalition of middle powers to act as a new moral compass for the world. If Canada, polite, apologetic, has never ever in its history initiated a war, Canada is trash-talking the US, then the old world really is dying, if it's not dead already. And the new world really is still waiting to be born. And we are definitely no longer in the land of business as usual. So, which is it? The time of monsters or the banality of evil? Let me suggest that the answer is both at the same time, and that any viable path forward that does not lead us deeper into fascism will need to reckon honestly with the fact that monsters and banality can and do work hand in hand with one another. No reason. We've established that something significant in the world order has been broken, and that intellectuals need to work in the service of social justice. At least I've established that. You all may not buy it yet. That's fine. But that still leaves us with a practical question. What precisely should we be doing to help fix the world? The standard academic answer to this question is that we can use our scholarly skills to analyze and understand the world better. What is going on? What is going wrong? How did we get here? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the forces we are trying to overcome? Where are the cracks in the structures we need to change that might give us useful leverage to do so? And so on. These are all important questions. We can and should work on addressing all of them effectively. But they're not enough. Not even close. And part of our problem as scholars, as intellectuals, as activists, as concerned citizens, is that too often we seem to assume that our expert analyses and penetrating insights are all we need to set the world right again, when that is not the case at all. Stuart Hall, one of the most important public intellectuals in the English-speaking world in the post-war era, put it this way, quote, "A large body of work in cultural studies and critical theory generally thinks that if you unmask an essentialism, it's finished. You've shown it's contradictory. You've shown the binary doesn't work. Well, what more are you going to do?" Out there, the essentialism is roaring away just as it ever was. It doesn't give a damn. It does not care a bit. It's not that the act of deconstruction is wrong, but that the deconstruction has to come back. It has to affect the practice in the real world, the people and the relationships and the institutions and what they do in the real world. So you've completed half the task, unquote. Too much of the US left, however, both academic and non-academic, appears never to have learned this lesson. On the academic side of that ledger, too many of us seem to think the need to affect the practice in the real world can be left to non-academics. That is, once we published our brilliant scholarly analyses of the world in some journal or book that a few dozen people might read, that one of those people will somehow find a way to translate our insights into meaningful real-world political action, and we don't have to do anything else. As if trickle-down scholarship would somehow work better than trickle-down economics ever did. Hint, it doesn't, and it won't. So one important thing that academic intellectuals need to be better about is finding ways to reach lay audiences more directly and more effectively. But even when left-leaning academics do such a thing, we have a bad habit of responding to right-wing lies and propaganda simply by trying to tell the truth. So we remind the general public that climate change is real, that vaccines do not cause autism, that voter fraud is not a serious problem, that immigrants have not destroyed America, and so on. The problem with such a line of argument, with such a strategy, is not that any of those facts are wrong or that we should stop repeating them. Those facts are not wrong, and repeating them may still be the best way to keep those truths somewhere in the public eye. But the truth by itself is not enough. Reason by itself is not enough. Ironically, we have put far too much faith in reason, and we've not taken seriously enough the obvious empirical fact that people across the political spectrum, not just conservatives, routinely hold tightly to beliefs that they feel to be true, even when presented with evidence that what they believe is in fact definitely false. MAGA conservatives, for example, are not interested in, nor will they be persuaded by, whatever facts we share with them in our efforts to help them see the proverbial light. In their eyes, what we call facts are nothing more than fake news, and so they can be safely ignored. At one level, of course, we know this because we've seen it happen over and over and over again for more than a decade now. The rational response to such a long history of failure on our part, however, should be that if we really want to persuade MAGA conservatives to see the world differently than they do, then we need some other strategy than the same one we've been trying and failing with for so long. And yet, we keep trying that strategy anyway. What we need instead of the same old strategy is what Larry Grossberg, arguably the foremost cultural studies scholar in the US for the past 50 years, likes to call better stories. Bad stories, he writes, make for bad politics. And the US left, he argues, has told a lot of bad stories over the years, while the right has told lots and lots of good ones. To be clear, in this context, good stories don't have to be true in any empirical, objective sense of the word. Their truth value is measured by the degree to which they resonate with their audience's experiences in and understandings of the world, and the degree to which they help people feel good, or seen, or understood, or appreciated, or righteous, or any number of other things. What that feeling is can and does vary. What matters is that the appeal is largely an affective one, an emotional one, rather than a rational one. One very broad example. Dating back to at least the 1960s, one of the most common and successful kinds of emotional appeals that the political right has made in the US over and over again has been about racialized fear. In particular, the right has told a broad range of stories to white voters that have blamed people of color for a variety of social and economic problems, blamed liberals for enabling people of color to cause all those problems, and portrayed conservatives as the only politicians who can and will set things right. It has not mattered that such stories are invariably demonstrably false. Their success has depended on whether they feel true to their target audiences rather than whether they are empirically true. In a country like the US, which has a long and ugly history of institutionalized racism and widespread white supremacist values, it should be easy to see how stories that traffic in racialized fear would be relatively easy to sell to white voters over and over and over again in multiple variations. As effective as the strategy has been for the political right, however, it is not an approach that the left has been able to imitate nearly as well. Part of that, hopefully, is because the left should not be leaning into racism, though it sometimes has. But at best, the left has occasionally tried to tell stories that portrayed billionaires and conservative politicians as the people that voters should really be afraid of. It is also trafficked in fear. And while such stories might seem to have the advantage of being more factually accurate than the right-wing stories, Donald Trump really will do more to hurt the average US citizen than any random immigrant ever could. These are still basically stories that try to fight the right's powerful emotional appeal with facts and reason. What the left hasn't done nearly enough of, though, is to tell affectively charged stories centered around hope. This is a lot tougher than it sounds to do well. Because doing such a thing well requires us to have a clear, plausible, substantive vision of whatever better future we want to build. Not just some vague, let's put this shit behind us negation of the present. Not just some fairy tale cliches about peace and harmony and community. It needs to be the kind of story that makes people believe deep down, not only that another world is possible, but that another world is worth the effort and the pain that it will take to build it. It needs to be a story that inspires people to connect and to support each other, even if, especially if, they aren't exactly on the same page already. Now, as I said at the start, I cannot pretend that I know how to tell such a story well. I don't. Largely because anything close to the genuinely better future that I would want to see at the heart of that story will need to look substantially different than just a return to the not-so-idyllic normalcy that Trump has disrupted. So very different that it is hard to know how to describe it to myself, much less to sell it to anyone else. The new world really is struggling to be born, but maybe, hopefully, we can be creative enough, bold enough, brave enough to help make that happen, and to make the new world a hell of a lot better than this one is. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Gil. Your lecture gave us already so many interesting things to debate, from monsters to hope to better stories. So let's start with a discussion. So we will start with the questions from students and then open up the floor.
Hello, thank you very much for an interesting talk. I'm Elizabeth, I'm a second-year student here, MICE program. Thanks for talking about this topic. When we think about intellectuals, either Gramscian or Hayekian, wherever you stand on the spectrum, we still agree that intellectuals have a function in the society, right? And we can call it organic function or the second-hand dealers of the ideas. But even though you set out the scene for that, you haven't talked about how it's practically done in the society. And right now, we are living in a society where the second-hand dealers of these ideas are mostly online. They are on TikTok, they are on Instagram, etc. And they provide these ideas in a short form, 60-second videos, and they have a huge reach. However, unlike traditional intellectuals and the organic intellectuals that we study about, these dealers of the ideas don't really have the intellectual background that the traditional intellectuals would have. So my question would be, how do you practically make sure that the traditional intellectuals have a bigger audience? Or how do you make sure that whoever has the audience provides the ideas that are not harmful? Thank you.
Maybe we collect one or two more questions and then we respond.
Hello, my name is Nikita Schuler. I'm a second-year student as well. I have one rather interesting question on what you said. You said that our world has changed, and many norms and many things that we deem today normal would once upon a time be completely abnormal. And you also talked about monsters, how monsters run our world today. Wouldn't you say then that these monsters are possibly the new good in our changing world, that these monsters come because they need to adapt to the changing world that we live in today? Yeah, that's it. I hope it makes sense.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Rita Hezerban, second-year student at the MICE program. And I would like to ask you your thoughts on why is it that so many intellectuals kind of still cling to the label of being apolitical? Do you think this stems more from a belief in pure objectivity, or is it more of a survival tactic kind of thing? Thank you.
Okay. That's a lot. First question. Right, traditional intellectuals. I can't even remember handwriting here. And a bigger audience, and the problems of being online. As part of my answer to that is not necessarily thinking about the bigger audience, so size can matter, but who's the right audience? Something I almost squeezed into my talk, but didn't figure out a way to do so neatly in terms of thinking about better stories, is that part of how you think about better stories is not just about the story, but about who is it you need to reach. You tell if you think about a US context for a moment, if your goal is to sort of sway voters, that is a particular kind of audience, and it requires a particular kind of story, and it's a particular size audience. But if your goal, if you think that what we need to do for change is to shift policymakers, that's a very different audience. And so part of the question about that notion of how you do political work is about, this goes to some of the need for understanding sort of the shape of the world and the state of the world and where the cracks are, where's a moment of leverage that you think would be effective, is then tailoring what you do to that space in that moment. There's no one-size-fits-all answer there. I think that part of what I was hearing in your question about secondhand sort of intellectual work, et cetera, that will be there. And arguably, we all engage in some version of that, because even when we're doing our own work, we are also sort of passing on what other people do. I mean, I cited a number of people in my talk, and they said, well, that's just a secondhand version of Said or Grossberg or Hall or what have you. Part of what I would want to say about the online space is a recognition, whoops, I'm losing my headpiece, is a recognition, make sure I do this so that you can hear me. I'll just do this way for now. Is recognition that the internet is a double-edged sword. One of the examples that I like to point to, and I've got students in my current seminar, forgive me because you've heard this, is we can think about the internet and social media as a place where there's a lot of toxicity. There's a lot of misinformation, and that's one of its downsides. We can also think about it as a space which offers the opportunity for communities that otherwise do not have a platform to speak and to be heard and to bear witness. We know a lot of what's going on, well, I know a lot of what's going on right now in Minneapolis precisely because there are ordinary citizens in the street with cell phones. The original police report from 2020 on George Floyd was that he died of cardiac arrest in his initial encounter with the police. Literally true, but it leaves out an awful lot of information. And forgive me, I cannot remember her name right now, but if the amazing woman who videoed his killing had not done that and put it online, that's the story that would have stuck. And it would simply have been another moment of racialized police killing in the US that nothing happened about. So, and that's itself arguably in its own way a kind of intellectual work, a kind of witnessing. And so I would take the internet aspect of that and say it works both ways. So I hope that sort of helps with that. As for the question about monsters being good, also complicated. I mean, my impulse is to say no, precisely because of the ways in which we tend not to think of monsters as good, outside of the occasional Disney film. Part of what one might recognize, I mean, I'll grant you this much. There are all sorts of things that we accept, even regardless of where we are on the political spectrum right now, as normal, as good, as reasonable, as moral, as just, as fair, that it is safe to say our descendants will think is absolute crap. Because we can look back in history and go, how did people think this was okay? And the idea that we are somehow exempt from that we don't do things right now that our descendants will think is monstrous, even if we think it's glorious, we shouldn't be so naive. It is also possible to recognize, and I'm not sure this is quite what you meant, but I should go here, is one of the problems with the monsters metaphor is that it becomes an easy way to scapegoat individuals. To claim that, and not just to scapegoat individuals, but to claim that the individuals themselves are inherently fundamentally evil creatures. Not that they have done bad things, but that they are themselves outside of humanity. And it shouldn't take too much to recognize that imagining human beings to be outside of humanity is in fact part of the things that we decry as monstrous. And so part of what I would want to sort of recognize is that it is possible. I'm not sure that I can name examples of this from the current administration right now, though I suspect they must exist somehow. Is that people who are doing things that we think of as monstrous also have moments where they rescue puppies or they do something wonderful for somebody. That may not be quite what you were trying to get at, but I think it's the best I've got there for now. And then to Rita's question about why intellectuals cling to the apolitical label so much. I mean, there are multiple answers here. One I will simply, though, take from Said. And one of the things he talks about in Representations of the Intellectual as one of the problems of what it means to try to do intellectual work. And he thinks that some of the worst things intellectuals can do is to lean too heavily into professionalism. Which is not to say they shouldn't be professionals, or they shouldn't sort of take a certain sort of care with what they do, but they think of what they do as a career, as a job, as something that needs to be advanced by ticking the boxes that your institution says you need to tick. That's a kind of professionalism, and in the context of universities, it's often a type of professionalism that says, you're not really political here. You are, you're just adding branches to the tree of knowledge. And that, I think in part, some people adhere to that because that's what they really believe they're doing. And I can't tell them they don't believe that. What I can say is that if that's what you're doing as a profession, you think that's sort of something, and you don't think there's a politics to that, then you're ignoring the fact that there are other people who are adding branches to trees of knowledge that are not being rewarded by universities for doing so, because their knowledge is not seen as elite or valued in that way. One quick example here we might think of as Wikipedia, which has its own weirdness, its own quirks, its own problems. But there's all sorts of knowledge on Wikipedia that would never, ever pass muster in a university setting. That doesn't mean it's not valuable knowledge in some way. There's all sorts of knowledge that has been produced over the centuries that has been sort of branded as sort of working class knowledge or women's knowledge or the knowledge from communities of color and thus not significant, that does not get into universities because it is not, quote unquote, important in the right way. And that part of that important in the right way, scare quotes around all of this, is one way in which the apolitical label gets attached to work that people like us do.
So there are a few more questions. I think there are still 3 students, and then we open up. Please.
Hi, my name is Yannick Bachmann. I'm a second-year student here. I recently got back from my exchange studies in the US at Stanford University, and I was wondering, I mean, I found it very valuable. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on the importance of having these exchanges like Fulbright that you are doing, and especially in times of monsters, how you label it, how Gramsci labels it, and if you already have some takeaways from your time being in Vienna, I would be super interested in hearing that. Thank you.
Okay.
Howdy, I'm Alex. You and I actually had lunch a few weeks ago, if you remember that. I'm Alex Exler. I was just wondering, because you were talking about how we need to come up with better stories. So is this then the job of the intellectuals? Is this the job of storytellers? Is there some way to unify those two? And also, I mean, what kinds of stories would work then? Because if you, in the past couple of elections, platitudes about like hope and togetherness really just have not won any elections. So that's my question.
Thank you very much. Matthias Krick, I'm first year in the ETIA course. Thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciated the components of the storytelling. And with the storytelling, I have a question. It says, how much of an enemy must be created of monsters to create heroes? And how much do we need to create heroes to have hope? In this modern world we live in, we can talk about monsters as much as we want to, and we can have fist fights or word fights on the stage. But is the monsters the stories we need, or do we need to write a new narrative to create hope?
Thanks. All right, the value of exchange. I mean, the simple and easy answer here is that I wouldn't be here if I didn't see value in it. And that's not just because it allowed Giulia and I to continue our collaboration. I think that as so many things are, it is complicated. I can say this, and with all due respect to our Fulbright Austria representative in the room, hi Lauren, and I do value the Fulbright program, even the U.S. version that it was not their fault that 200 of us got sort of dinged. That was the State Department. There are, I think, it sounds cliched, it sounds romantic, it sounds naive. There are all sorts of ways in which being in a different country, in a different place, where the world is organized differently, even if there are all sorts of things that seem familiar, can be an important way to unsettle your own assumptions about what is normal, what is right, what is necessary, how the world has to work. That can be both expansive for your own thinking, but also for the ways in which you deal with the world and try to change the world. And that is possible to do within your own culture. It's not guaranteed you do it simply because you travel, but travel is one potentially easier way to make some of that happen, simply because it can force you to encounter ways of moving through the world that you've never encountered before, and ways of organizing the world you've never encountered before. I'm not sure I'm quite ready yet to sort of hold forth in terms of what I think I've learned in that respect from my time here so far. I've got some ideas, but they're not formulated well enough yet that I think I can put them out sort of cleanly just now. So forgive me for not being able to touch on that. The question about whose job it is to tell better stories. Arguably, it's all of our jobs. One thing I would take from a particular Gramscian vision of the intellectual is he says that all people are intellectuals, just only some people understand themselves to have the function of intellectual. I would very much want to not conflate academia with intellectualism and say that only academics can be intellectuals, and that no one outside of academia can be. If anything, I would say that the kind of intellectuals that Said is celebrating, or that Stuart Hall in his own way would celebrate, many of them exist outside and always existed outside of academia. I think in many contexts, and this may get back to the first-hand, second-hand sort of notion of intellectual work that our first questioner asked. Part of my allergy to that notion of trickle-down academia is that I actually believe that if we are doing the kind of complicated analysis of the world that we should be, that we also need to find a way to articulate that ourselves so that people outside the academy can understand it. Assuming that a journalist can do that for us, or that someone else can do that for us. It's not that there shouldn't be people who try that. It's not that those sort of functions shouldn't exist, but that assuming that, well, we just create the knowledge and it's somebody else's job to sort of package it and sort of deliver it to a public, has its own weird elitism to it, which I'm not comfortable with. Finally, about the need for monsters, the need for heroes. I think it is possible to tell stories that do not have to fall into those tropes. It is difficult, not because that's somehow beyond our capabilities as human beings or as storytellers, but because the stories we are so used to telling and hearing and trying to convey to others fit into those models. Let me give you one example from that I'm stealing from a piece I co-wrote with a former graduate student on Django Unchained, the Quentin Tarantino film. There's a moment in there where we're responding to the critique that people made of the film, saying that why didn't the movie about Django sort of starting a slave uprising and sort of starting the revolution? And part of what we say is, well, think about most Hollywood movies that try to engage with quote unquote serious political issues, which tend to reduce those political issues to struggles between particularly sort of noble heroes or heroines and particularly evil people. So 9 to 5 takes sort of feminism and doesn't make it a collective struggle. It says, oh, well, here's a particularly evil male boss whom we struggle with, 3 women struggle with. There are versions of that for class, there are versions of that for race, that I think that if you want to get major sort of cinematic work that turns the collective into a hero, you almost have to go back to like Potemkin and Eisenstein and like early Soviet film. One of the things we find particularly interesting about Django, it does the hero-villain thing, but at some level it actually makes institutional racism the villain. At the end, it's the house that Django needs to blow up. Sorry, I'm ruining the movie for some people, I know. And the house that stands for a system. And the movie doesn't portray racism as simply, well, it's just this one bad guy who needs to be taken down. And so in that sense, it's possible to tell stories, and it's weird to sort of defend Quentin Tarantino in that way, I know, but it's possible to tell stories that do not simply celebrate the hero or the villain that way, but it's difficult, not because they can't be told, but because if you're trying to reach audiences that you want to move, at some level you also have to meet them where they are, which means working with genres and sort of styles of narrative that they know. You can bend those, you can push those, but sort of like the way I ended, that's easier to say in the abstract than it is to figure out how to do and do it well.
So I think now we can open the floor to other questions to the broader audience. So yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Isabel. I'm also a MICE 2 student. I was wondering, you mentioned that the narrative of the left of kind of critiquing the elite has not been as effective, but we've kind of seen the right, and also specifically Trump's administration, do the same, I would say, and employing this kind of populist rhetoric as well. But to me, that seems to have been way more effective. So I was wondering if you agree, and what kind of factors could explain that. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you very much. It was fascinating, and it comes back to a lot of things that I'm thinking right now in my own research, so I'm going to try to be very brief. So it feels right now as scholars we are stuck between liberalism and authoritarianism, especially as critical scholar, when we say, yeah, but the liberal order was not so great, then we are pushed into this binary. So I was thinking about the necessity of opening the political imaginary. So I would like to hear you about this, how to get out of this binary obligation that we have right now. And second, about the trickle down of academia, I think we have great examples of, it has its epistemic issues, but we have great example of participative research where trying to do things not in an extractivist way, to take data, to try to trickle down, but just to be part of communities, which bring me to the very important word, participation. If it feels like we already have some ideas of how to not as scholar to trickle down something, but to participate in something, it feels like we have more, yeah, we can move forward maybe. I would like to hear you more about this. Thank you.
Dr. Rodman, sir, thank you for the speech. It was exciting. And you talked about...
Can you speak a bit louder?
Yes. Thank you, sir, for... It was exciting. And you talked about the need for a new strategy as opposed to the one we've been trying over and over again. So assume we as intellectuals want to be a counterpart to the monsters and the banality working together. And could you perhaps share good practices, best practices that keeps us a part of academic apparatus while maintaining critical approach in our research and yet not being labeled as too woke of scholars? Thank you.
All right. Critique of elites from the left and the right. I think you're right that the right has engaged in a kind of critique of, or taking jabs at the elite. How effective that is trickier to say. It depends on what we mean by effective. I mean, insofar as the right has won power, it's been effective. It's not clear so much whether that has been part of what has made it happen. And I think, like a lot of the what I would say, at least, the right stories, is that its factual accuracy is almost irrelevant. I mean, it's really weird to hear Donald Trump trying to claim that elites are the problem, as someone who has never worked a day in his life. So yeah, I mean, so effectiveness, I think, is tricky there. And I think that to the extent that the right stories have been more effective, I mean, I would have to do the research. I'm not sure that the attack on elitism has been what has tipped that scale. That may, in fact, be a line of critique that has not worked as well for them, except insofar as they've managed, I guess at some moments, I guess this has worked, to portray at least a particular slice of the urban upper middle class and a particular slice of Hollywood, for instance, the Hollywood elite, the cultural elite, as the problem. That's a different kind of elite than the 1%. I mean, so it may also be that part of the distinction in your question is about different visions of who the elite actually are. Vanessa's sort of multiple questions here. For the participation, yes. And I think that part of what I would say with respect to that is, I think this comes through, for me at least, a bit more in Said and in some stuff that I again, thought about squeezing in but didn't. The kind of political work or political/intellectual work that I would value is not vanguardist. It is not about saying, we have the answers and now I will bring them to you. It is as much about listening to, working with communities and populations, being part of those. This may also be a different version of the answer that I was giving to someone else. I've already lost track of whom, forgive me. Where intellectuals are not just us in university or sort of institutional settings. I mean, part of Gramsci's notion of the organic intellectual would be sort of just as likely to be sort of steel workers as a professor. And that is also kind of intellectual work, where everybody has the potential role of being an intellectual, and that kind of participation can happen across job descriptions, across class lines, across sort of, and ideally should. I mean, if we're thinking about the kinds of solidarity that we want and coalitions that we want, that would necessarily involve dealing with multiple people and with multiple communities of various sorts. How we escape the binary of liberalism versus authoritarianism, I think we need to escape it. What that looks like, I don't have a good answer for. Not because I can't imagine something, I mean, there's a part of me that wants to say, go old school, sort of socialist here in some ways, while recognizing that it has its own issues, particularly historically. I mean, part of our problem is that almost any vision of politics that we have on any model, when it's been tried in the world, has never quite worked out the way it's supposed to ideally. And sometimes the question is, well, is that a problem with the model or is that a problem with its implementation? Does that mean that we could then sort of say, well, socialism could work if we actually did it right, but people will say that about capitalism. I'm not convinced that's true of capitalism. I'm not sure there's such a thing as ethical capitalism. It's a system that depends on the losers. That's what competition is about. You start a widget factory, I start a widget factory, and we try to drive each other out of business. Socialism might be, again, a different version of that kind of participation, but whether that can actually work in the world cleanly, I don't know. So I don't have a good answer there, I'll admit. Best practices, if I had an easy answer for that, that's all I would have talked about. I would have said, here's the best practices, here's what we should do. And I think that my impulse is to say that there is no such thing as universal best practices, because what needs to happen are interventions that get made in very contextual ways, in very context-specific ways. For me, one of the lessons of cultural studies, and one of the difficulties of explaining cultural studies to people, particularly new students, is that they want, well, what's the methodology, what's the theory, how do I do this, give me the 12 steps and I'm good. And I said, well, it doesn't work that way, because what worked for cultural studies in the UK in 1975 is not what will work in Austria in 2026. It's not what could work in the US in 1990. You move across space and or time, and the political and intellectual needs of the moment vary. They shift, they change. What counts as best practices shifts. It's no longer the same. And partially that's because both power and resistance to power, we've seen they respond to each other. They change. I mean, to give you one US example, for much of the late 50s and into the 60s, and maybe even a little bit into the early 70s, activists of a variety of sorts, but especially on the left, their goal was to get on TV. It was Martin Luther King's goal, it was the Yippies' goal. It didn't even matter that Abbie Hoffman was very straight up about this. He said, I don't care whether it's good publicity or bad publicity. If I'm on TV, then I've succeeded, because sort of what I am and who I am is now there on television, and it matters. There are arguments to be made, good arguments to be made, that part of what ended the US involvement in Vietnam was the horror of the war coming into people's homes on television. Part of what made the Black Civil Rights Movement work was people in the North seeing on television black bodies being abused, peaceful black bodies being abused by white police officers and white citizens. We can't take that strategy and pick it up now and say, okay, just try to get on TV and it's good enough. One of the things that I know all sorts of people, when the language here is all loaded and problematic, what's typically referred to in the US as the first Gulf War, bearing in mind that the second Gulf War was really just more of the first Gulf War. We just stopped talking about what happened in the middle. There were huge, huge protests. None of them got on TV, in part because major TV networks learned, we just don't cover this. And when we don't cover it, then the war doesn't become the same problem for the nation that it did with Vietnam. And so the strategy from the left had to change. Going into the streets didn't mean the same thing in that way. For that matter, we could see that in responses to Trump. That Trump's first term, so the women's marches that happened over and over and over again, millions and millions of people in the streets all across the country, almost no TV coverage. If you were simply looking at the news, you would not know that resistance existed. Maybe back to an earlier question, to know that resistance existed, you would have to find it on social media, because you couldn't find it in the New York Times, or you couldn't find it on CNN. And so best practices will shift, they will change, and they need to. We sort of, that's part of why the work is ongoing, and not just, here is this lesson that we got from, pick your old romantic revolutionary hero, from whatever era and place you want, and just try to apply it any place else. It won't work the same way. It can't.
Are there other questions or interventions, comments? Other stories? Yes, please.
Hello, thanks for the talk. My name is Evan Butler. I'm a MICE 2 student from America. You mentioned this sort of in your comments on Django Unchained. And you, in regards to the stories we need to develop to, for lack of a better word, kind of defeat the conservative narratives, how much work does those on the left have to do to stop defeating their own narratives before they ever get off the ground? I've read plenty of movie reviews and been a leftist long enough to know that there's a strong tradition of infighting. Whereas every conservative movie that comes out, it's perfect, and it's exactly the message we should be sending. Whereas, it's very common for leftists to knock each other's ideas down first. So what work is there to be done on that front?
Good question, complicated question. So I think I would make a case that some of that infighting, if that's even the word we want to use for it, is necessary, valuable, important. It's about sort of acknowledging and recognizing that we're not perfect, that we have differences, and that those differences are maybe important to work out in public. There are ways in which not doing that can produce its own weird kinds of silences. So that, for instance, one of the problems with the Black civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s is that it is very patriarchal in its organization and in its public face. There were all sorts of women who were crucial to that movement, who were vital to that movement, who wanted to put issues that, not the language they would have used then, but that we would now call feminism, in play, and were basically told, for a variety of reasons, some good, some bad. The good were recognizing that in that moment, it was going to be difficult for the nation, for the white nation, to deal with multiple narratives from the movement. It was not going to accept that. It needed a single narrative. That's its own problem, but it's not the fault of the movement. But within the movement, part of the problem was precisely that they were men who were saying, well, we'll get race sorted out first, and then when we figure that out, we can turn to gender, which is not such a smooth move. Part of what we get with third wave feminism is, in fact, putting those stories back in front, and a way to sort of help to complicate the story of what racial justice would mean. It doesn't mean that all infighting and all disagreement, among the left is helpful or necessary or important to do in public, and I think there's some of it that we could talk about as a kind of insistence on a certain ideological purity that sometimes happens, and some of that critique is, you aren't, this goes to somebody else's question earlier, I think, you aren't woke enough, or your wokeness is flawed because you're great on class and you're great on race, but you've dropped the ball on gender, you've dropped the ball on the environment, or what have you. That doesn't mean you haven't necessarily dropped the ball someplace, but, and this, back to Nina's question, is something we need to think about contextually. There are moments where it is important to recognize that you don't want to make the perfect the sort of enemy of the good. There are battles that can be won in the moment that might get lost if we insist, we got to get all the pie and not just 40 or 50% of the pie. There are other moments where that 40 or 50% of the pie is precisely a kind of delay strategy that is problematic. Go slow. You're not ready to integrate yet. You're not ready for a woman president yet. You're not ready for whatever it might be. But we'll get there. So complicated. I don't know if that's sorry. It's my most common answer tonight. It's all complicated.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. If I may pose an addition to the question and the challenge to the narrative. How much are we shooting ourselves in the foot by setting a bipolar setting? We are constantly talking about left and right. But that means right has to start somewhere and left has to start somewhere. So the moment I am further on the right foot than on the left, I am now the enemy of the person sitting next to me. How much in this context are we stopping ourselves from making movement forward? Because some of those that stand on more on the right leg and those standing more on the left leg share the same meal. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're differentiating in their approaches.
Also good question, also complicated question. And I think it comes back to thinking textually. So one of the things that I would argue, and this goes to a version of better stories, one of the things the left has been, at least in the US, has been bad at is too often it has framed the right as not just monsters at the top, but monsters all the way down. As dumb, as racist, as problematic, as somehow not worth our time. And there are all sorts of aspects of that will not help us get much further. Not because I think we can all join hands and sing Kumbaya and have graham crackers and milk and be fine. Or there are no serious disagreements, or that some of the disagreements are more than just disagreements. They are, in fact, violence. That there's a difference between saying, well, I think that your version of a tax system and my version of a tax system, aren't the same. That may be minor and can be worked out in the big scheme of things. If I think, well, people like you should be killed, and you think people like me, should simply be voted out, those are two different sort of levels of discussion. That's hard to sort of come to, and I don't want you to be killed, thank you. Part of what I was much too briefly trying to flag at the end about sort of people not being on the same page and the need to sort that out, and recognizing that some of the big we, are the monsters. Almost 80 million people voted for Trump the second time around. That is a lot of people. That is more than 25% of the adult population of the United States. Those are people who, if we are going to be a nation, we need to live with, we need to work with. To say otherwise is to do its own form of exclusionary violence, to say, oh no, you were not human, we can't, How we bridge that gap is hard to say. Some of it, yes, is maybe exacerbated by too simple notions of left and right. And we can recognize there are ways in which there's moments of commonality in some cases that we could sort of potentially bridge. Some of that is a kind of thinking about better stories, to recognize that there are folks who are economically disadvantaged, who occupy, in their own heads, positions on the left and the right, who have an awful lot in common in terms of their class position, in terms of whether they can get health care, whether they have jobs, whether they'll be able to pay the rent. There are ways to form alliances there, and some of those are made more difficult by thinking about this as right and left. Part of that arguably goes to certain versions of stories that people have bought into, because if you believe that you are unemployed because immigrants have taken your job, then it becomes hard for people who are supporting immigrants to make common cause with you. It becomes hard for you to make common cause with people who are supporting immigrants if that's the narrative you believe. Or if you believe that the people who believe that are just inherently racist, and you can't tolerate that, then it's also hard to make common cause that way. There are potentially grounds for making that common cause. They are hard to find. Not that they're impossible and fine, and I can't say I'm an expert at doing it. But I can imagine ways in which that work can be done, but it's not easy work, partially because of those labels that you're pointing out that separate people, partially because we've not found the stories to tell that get around those labels. Which doesn't mean we've solved the political problem, or we've suddenly made everybody agree with each other. But it means that there are ways in which we could tell those stories that find those points of connection. To the extent that solidarity works in any context, it is not always about forgetting about the differences that people have with one another. It's about putting them aside long enough to work towards a common cause. One of the things, I'll just do a brief personal story. I know we're pushing time here, but the October No Kings marches in the US, the one in Minneapolis, I went to. It was around I lived downtown Minneapolis, and so it was an easy sort of walk to get there. And as I was walking around this huge crowd, that I saw signs for just about every cause you could possibly imagine that you could think of as a leftist cause. Anti-racism, feminism, trans rights, the environment, healthcare, you name it, it was there. And I saw absolutely no disagreement with people around there. People at that moment, they came with different agendas. There was no unified agenda there beyond, we're not happy with the current administration. That was a kind of solidarity that didn't pretend that people didn't necessarily agree with each other about some of these things, but that saw an issue in which they could create that common ground. Ideally, that's the kind of story we can find ways to tell and make work. But it's not easy work to do.
I would like to jump in to this because, and I think that this is also related to what Vanessa was suggesting about opening up this political imaginary and maybe, telling better stories, but also imagining other possibilities, other more fluid identity formations and forms of solidarity, like, for example, sharing a neighborhood or sharing a cause, which doesn't mean that we have to be the same kind of person to do that, but building solidarity around ways of acting instead of ways of being, identifying with something. And I also wanted to stress that I do share this frustration concerning these very rigid boundaries between this, the right and the left, or these national formations, like thinking as if the nation would be something that determines you. And we experience this all the time, also because we are surrounded, like, for example, now in Vienna, we are expecting now the Eurovision Song Contest, and there is a lot of debate about, boycott and who should be performing, who should not. But the thing is that, what if maybe these singers or performers, what if they would perform something different than nationalities? Why isn't it possible to create spaces for this kind of public performance? And I think that this means for intellectuals and intellectual work that we also need to open up this imagination as doing intellectual work as if we would just produce knowledge, but maybe shifting more the attention towards creating the right space for other kind of stories, of encounters. And I think that many of us also share this frustration and maybe also feel very exhausted of these digital environments. I think that we are now experiencing more and more this need for actually gathering together, not just after the pandemic, but really because, we are surrounded by monsters, not because they are there all the time, but because the flows of information gives them such a visibility that it just make many other stories and many other good things are just invisible or less visible. So I think that this is also something that needs to be done. And as a matter of fact, a key element of authoritarian politics is cutting funding to the work of intermediaries, being it journalists, being it cultural institutions, organizations, those people who have created these safe spaces, even academia, these safe spaces for people to get together and discuss without having to identify as being X or Y. So this is just a thought I wanted to share. But I think that now we are approaching the end of this, at least more official part of the evening. So I want to thank again Gil Rodman for his inspiring lecture, and I want to thank all of you for this lively discussion and for your questions and engagement. And I want to thank again Fulbright Austria for making this visit possible, and for their continued commitment to fostering transatlantic dialogue. And before we close, I'm also very happy to invite you, those who are here, not those online, to stay a bit longer, since Fulbright Austria has kindly offered refreshments just outside. So please join us for a less formal part of the evening. And thanks again for being here tonight, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you for me too.